Well, thank you very much. First of all, can I say what an honour it is as a historian to address an archaeology conference, and I hope you'll forgive me. I'm afraid what I'm talking about today has got a lot about texts and rather less about material culture, but hopefully some of the thinking might inform how you go out and look at the objects in the ground and on the landscape. I hope that's okay. So I want today to look at early modern perspectives on the Tay Valley. And this is coming out of some of the work which really David Parkinson of the University of Saskatchewan initiated in a fantastic project on the Muses Threnody, which some of you may be familiar with. So David has got an excellent new edition of the Muses Threnody now out with Scottish Text Society, but we're trying to take that as a starting point and look much more broadly at the history of the Tay Valley between about 1400 and about 1700. And today, what I'm going to try and do is look at some extracts from the Muses Threnody, but put it in the context of wider discourse about the Tay Valley. So lots of other documents from the period to do with the Tay Valley. Can I start off? Could I have a show of hands? Could you raise your hand if you've heard of the Muses Threnody? Some of you, this is good. The message is spreading. That's great. Excellent. So it is a long poem by the Perth schoolmaster Henry Adamson. It's published in 1638, but it's being worked on a little bit earlier than that. And it looks back to the time that Adamson spent with his friend John Gall, really exploring the landscape around Perth, probably in the years around 1600. So they're going out, they're walking, they're hunting, they're practicing archery, they're even sometimes playing golf, and they're also occasionally going boating. Now, the landscape that Adamson represents is idealized at times. He has quite a lot of classical references, but he also is just pretty positive about the place. He describes going up to the north of Perth and looking down and saying how we made and viewed Balhouse's situation, overlooking all that spacious, pleasant valley with flowers damasked. So he's thinking about the countryside around Perth like a wonderful, beautiful, rich fabric damasked with flowers. And there's a sense coming through that this is an exceptionally attractive and significant landscape. We learn about him writing about what blooming banks sweet Erne or fairest Tay or Ammon doth embrace. These many a day we haunted were our pleasant pastorals we sweetly sung. So it's very, very positive about the landscape by and large. But I suggest that the idea that this is an exceptionally significant, attractive landscape, the landscape of the Tay Valley, is actually rooted in wider discourse of the period about the Tay. A lot of the features that Adamson identifies can be shared with other writers. So the idea that the Tay is an incredibly important river is so prevalent in the early modern Scottish sources. I've got a couple of examples here, but there are many, many more sources, both interestingly from Scotland and actually from English writers visiting Scotland. For example, in 1603, John Moneypenny is writing how the water of Tay cometh forth of Loch Tay in Breadalbin. The loch is 24 miles of length. Tay is the greatest river in Scotland. And this line that Tay is the greatest river in Scotland is repeated over and over again in the early modern sources. Now, the idea that the Tay is a powerful river fed by numerous tributaries obviously comes through in the early modern sources. But there's also a sense in the early modern literature that the watercourses around Perth are being tamed in some way, that they are becoming these more managed spaces. They're not simply wild. They're not natural power beyond the reach of man. And we see in Adamson and the Muses Threnody talking about he's going up to Low's work. Many of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with that that sort of remains of a medieval barrier feeding into the direction of the Mill Lade for Perth. But he says about how they go up there and never stayed till we came to Low's work, built by our mighty king for to preserve us, that thenceforth waters should not drown, but serve us. Very specific statements that the water is being put to use to serve the people of Perth rather than overwhelming them. And this idea of humanity overcoming the power of the river is also present in something called, in a poem by Alexander Craig, which was composed for the welcome of James VI when he returns to visit Scotland in 1617, and is given to him at the time of James VI coming past Kinnaird. And Alexander Craig again picks up on this idea of a powerful River Tay, which in this case the king is sort of bringing into orderliness. Craig says about how stately Tay with striving streams, which marches and scorns his course, should be controlled with arches, who with his spears in spiteful rage has drowned the famous Perth's Faire bridge and brought to ground. So we've got this idea already of, you're familiar with the idea there was several bridges across the Tay at Perth, which were swept away and damaged by floodwaters. But now we've got the idea that with James VI coming, they shall strain the strength of his strong streams, they'll see, and be at peace with all the world for thee. So James's presence is bringing the river into submission. So we've got interesting insights into the relationship of humanity with the power of the river. We've got Adamson also stressing, and this is something that comes through a lot in the Muses Society, is the Tay Valley's productive potential, both the productive potential of the river and also of the wider sort of Tay Valley basin. So Adamson says about how in the area we can find wild beasts in forests of all kinds in plenty, rare fowls, fruits, fishes, and what else is dainty. And this idea of plenty from the river comes through in a lot of the contemporary sources. So we have things like John Bellington's translation of Hector Boyce, so it's early 16th century history of Scotland, writing about how the Tay rises from Loch Tay, which is 24 miles of length and 10 miles of breadth, and descends with great plenty of fishes. So the idea, this is a plentiful space. It wasn't just people who were positively disposed to the region who necessarily comment on this feeling of plenty and on the remarkable nature of the landscape and waters of the Tay Valley. Are you all familiar with the castle at Broughty Ferry down on the edge of Dundee? So that was occupied during the winter of 1547-48 by an English army, and the English commander there, Andrew Dudley, writes a lot of letters actually about the Tay, fascinating insights both to what they're doing at Broughty Ferry, but actually also insights into the English raids further up the Tay, including the attacks on some of the monastic sites on adjacent to the Tay. And he's actually quite interested, Dudley, in the fish in the river. He talks about it being a good river for navigation, but also a good river for fish. It's one of the goodliest rivers that ever I saw, and the ships may ride as well here as they would in the Thames, and is one of the plentifulest rivers of fish as ever I saw, both salmon, porpoise, seal, herring, and other kind of fish. Yeah, the plenty of the Tay Valley was not just from fishing, and that's something that comes through actually in Dudley's other writings and very much strongly comes through in Adamson's work. The Tay Valley is regarded in Scottish context as an exceptionally fertile farmland, and there's a repeated emphasis both on pasture and on arable land. So Adamson, for example, says about how he's sort of comparing the Perth landscape to some people who are comparing it with the Mediterranean, and says about, let scoffers say that neither wine nor oil grows within this soil. So obviously sort of southern Mediterranean produce. Yea, things more needful for man's use it yields. Herds, flocks and corns abound here in our fields. And this idea of flocks and corns comes up over and over again in the late medieval and early modern sources. So we have things like John Harding, an English chronicler who's in the 15th century, frankly, trying to encourage an invasion of Scotland. He writes about the Castle of Gowrie. A plentiful country are you warrant, of corn and cattle and all commodities. Towards the end of the 16th century, we have James Dalrymple's 1596 translation of Bishop Lesley's History of Scotland. He writes about the landscape around the Tay, abounding both in profitable pasture and in fertile corns. Now, I could go on. There's many, many more examples of this particular type of thing. It's just, we're running out of time, but I promise you that they are there. It isn't just, though, a landscape of farming, it's also a landscape of hunting. And references to parks and deers abound. I think it's a reminder, of course, that hunting here is managed. Adamson travels across to Scone and writes about the palace fair, which doth so richly stand, where gardens, orchards, parks on either hand, where flowers and fruits, the heart and fallow deer, for smell, for taste, for venison and cheer, the nose, the mouth and palate, which may please. So sort of multiple senses there being included. And that's got notable similarities with the welcome that Craig gives to James VI at Kinnaird in 1617, where he encourages the king to enjoy through forests, parks and fields, hunt stag and hare. It helps the health to have the native air. All of this builds together to create an impression of the Tay Valley, and in particular the area around Perth, as in many ways an ideal setting, an ideal landscape. And we see this with, for example, Adamson writing about the area immediately adjacent to Perth and saying about how through these horses of fair and fertile ground, which with fruit trees, with corns and flocks abound, meandering rivers, sweet flowers, heavenly honey, we went a-shooting. The idea that the area immediately adjacent to Perth is exceptionally attractive comes across actually in Philemon Holland's translation of Camden's Britannia. And he writes about how that's what it's published in, but it's a translation. This particular extract is actually a poem by John Johnston. Sorry, just to make it clearer, layers of authors. But the key thing is we have got something which is poems about Perth, and in it it's praising near to the waters clear of Tay and pleasant plains all green. In middle ground between them stands Perth proudly like a queen. Of noble kings the stately seat and palace once it was, fair for the sight and rich withal, for spring of corn and grass. So we've got actually quite a lot of things going on in that extract. We've got an emphasis on the clear waters of Tay. Incidentally, that phrase is very like the phrase used in the parliamentary record for the official measurement of the pint in Scotland. The pint is officially measured by a certain amount of clear Tay water. And that's from the 15th century. So we've got sort of this emphasis on the clear waters of Tay. We've got this reference back to Perth's royal heritage, but we also have this stressing that it's surrounded with corn and grass. Meanwhile, James Dalrymple, in his translation of Bishop Lesley, emphasises Perth, in a very delectable place, is it situate. I think this is quite interesting. I think it's interesting partly because we're seeing a value in the urban-rural interface. We're seeing the place where the town encounters the countryside as, in the eyes of these poets and historians, as a particularly attractive space. I think it's also important, in contrast to perhaps a slightly grim picture we at times get from some elements of archaeological evidence, is being perceived as a place of orchards, of arable, of pasture, of attractive rivers rather than polluted waters. It is a very positive depiction. And I think this ties in to an idea that, at least in literature, the Tay Valley is almost a perfect landscape of pleasure and profit, of recreation and of work. So when Adamson, when he's looking down, he says, looking along that painted spacious field, which jars with pleasure profit sweetly yield, the fair south inch of Perth and banks of Tay. So he's looking across the south inch, which of course still survives today, and looking as this beautiful, beautiful space, but which is both a space of pleasure and profit. If we look at translation of Arthur Johnston's lines on Perth, 17th century translation of this, we note again, pleasure and profit is coming through. He writes about, in praise thou dost deserve to have thy share, for cleanliness and for thy wholesome air, and for that river by which thou dost stand, whose streams make fertile all its neighbouring land. Near by thee there are woods where one may kill the stags and roes and snare with nets at wool. And from this cast not far off is, which bears most fragrant apples and most luscious pears, was thus thou dost a happy mixture make. Again with pleasure, nothing dost thou lack. So we have in this landscape, we have in many ways a delight in the landscape. It's practical, but it's also aesthetic and recreational. And in some ways, this ties into sort of some of the theories of people like T.C. Smelt on early modern landscapes as places of use and delight. But to wrap up, what I want to argue is the Muse's Threnody is in many ways not an outlier. It's actually part of a really established discourse which provides a positive perception of the landscapes of Lower Tay Valley, and that these accounts are informed both by local residents, but they're also informed by visitors to the region. And it seems that for at least some early modern observers, the Tay Valley had the key features needed of an ideal landscape. It has a navigable river, it has good fishing, good hunting, good pasture, fruitful orchards, and plentiful grain. And I think this is quite a helpful insight into perceptions of the period. And I feel at times contrasts with some modern portrayals of the early modern period and of the challenges of the Little Ice Age. I also think these descriptions are very interesting because they provide a value to spaces we haven't always appreciated as later generations. A significant proportion of the sites that Adamson is describing have been severely disrupted by the developments of the 19th and 20th centuries. And some of the remaining areas which remain on that sort of fragile interface between town and country are facing development now today. So I think it's important to recognise the value that previous generations placed on it. But of course, there is a really big question. How far is this landscape that they're describing imagined? And that's something which really, our next phase of research going forwards, we really want to try and unpick. We want, in this context, to work probably primarily with the historical sources, looking at things like economic records, the very extensive charter evidence for the region. But also, I'd very much like us to have further dialogue with archaeologists and to look at the surviving environmental record to see if we can actually have physical evidence to compare with these delightful verses about the wonders of the Tay. Thank you very much.